Welcome to Shifting Perspectives.
Biblical conversations about topics that matter. Let's get to it. Hey everybody, welcome back to Shifting Perspectives, and we have been having a really good conversation about biblical finances and what does stewardship look like? How do we respect that God owns it all and be managers of that? What does godly debt look like? And we could spend a lot of time on that one in and of itself. What does it look like to have a generous heart? And we've come to probably what is one of the most contentious subjects of biblical finance, and that's tithing. And you can go anywhere on the internet, especially with the proliferation today of access to information and opinions that we have, and find someone who is of the opinion that tithing was of the old covenant, and with the coming of Christ and the new covenant, there is no need for a Christian to tithe. And so today we would kind of want to unpack that a little bit and really talk about why we believe that tithing is the first step really in being a good steward, in understanding how to manage our finances, and ultimately how to be generous. And that's with tithing. So I want to flip that to you. And again, you get to work in the sphere of finances. So you have conversations with lots and lots of people that I may not get the opportunity to speak to, that may have questions about managing their money. And if someone was to come to you today and say, hey, I heard at my church, well, let's just do it this way. I heard at my church that I don't have to tithe, that all I have to do is give whatever I might want to give, and that's okay. What would you tell that person?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we have to, anytime we have a spiritual question, we have to go back, and it's not what I say, it's what the Scripture say.
Exactly.
And so, we go back to Scripture, and Scripture tells us, it gives us the instructions that we are, we are to be cheerful givers, that we are to tithe, that we are to give the first fruits, that we are to, so Scripture clearly defines that we are to give. So a lot of people use the 10% rule because, I'm supposed to give 10%. That's, kind of that's kind of comes back from the Old Testament. I'm supposed to give 10%, and I can't do that. So I'm not going to give anything. I'm not giving what's this. And then the other question becomes back, and I'll toss this back to you for your thoughts, is you got tithes and then you've got offerings,
right?
And many times those are used synonymously. So what does the difference of that look like biblically?
Sure. So there's actually three biblical categories of giving. There's the tithe, there is offerings, and there is alms. And sometimes those things kind of get muddied together. And I oftentimes get asked the question, hey, can I give my tithe to a missionary in Guatemala? The answer is no, because the Bible doesn't define a tithe as something that's given to missions. Matter of fact, giving to missions in particular is specifically called an offering. Paul talks about it. He talks about the offerings that the Philippian church gave. He talks about in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians chapter 9, he talks about the giving that was offerings that was for missions. And that's very important, but that's not the tithe, because the offering is something that goes to something that is not the local church. But yet the tithe, all throughout Scripture, including the Old Testament law, which we oftentimes want to get away from and say, oh, well, we're not under the law, we're under the Spirit, right? Because of the new covenant. Correct. But the giving of the tithe was for the purpose of the ministry of the local church.
Yes.
So tithes in the Old Testament went to not just to the temple, but there were synagogues that received the tithe, and there were those who benefited from the tithe. Like, for example, you know that there are 12 tribes of Israel. Did you know the tribe of Levi received a portion of the tithes from all of the others, because they didn't have a portion. They didn't have land. They weren't raising their own crops. They weren't doing anything. They were doing the work of God. And so by the time you get through the Old Testament picture and you get to the book of Malachi, you find the clearest definition bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. What's the storehouse of God's people? The storehouse of God's people is the local church. So that there will be meat in my house. In other words, so that there will be the ability to be able to do ministry from my house, if I could just put that in layman's terms. So really the tithe is that first of those three areas of giving that belongs to and is for the purpose of God's ministry continuing in the earth. Mm-hmm. And so with that, then you have to define the question, well, if that was the intent of the tithe throughout the Old Testament, and even into the New Testament. And when Jesus himself says that you should both act mercifully and have generosity towards others and take care of the orphan, the widow, all of those things that have offerings, yet he also in Matthew 23 says, but yet you should still tithe. Mm-hmm. So then you begin to ask the question, well, what does that look like today? And you'd have to look outside of the law to begin to see what that looks like today. You'd begin to have to go back to Abraham before the law, and Abraham and Melchizedek, which Melchizedek was what we call the king of Salem. Salem was a pre-Jerusalem name for Jerusalem, and Melchizedek was what we in spiritual terms call a pre-incarnate Christ, right? It's a pre-Christ coming in the New Testament expression of him in the Old Testament, right? And in Hebrews chapter 7 in the New Testament, it's described that we give tithes under the new covenant to our high priest of the order of Melchizedek. In other words, it's linking tithing back to pre-law as the expression of tithing to Christ after Christ has come. That Christ in heavenly places receives the tithe from us today. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 7. And what is Christ the head of? He's the head of the church, right? Christ is the head of the church. So does the tithe belong in the church for the sake of Christ and his mission going forward? The answer ultimately is yes. And so those are kind of pictures of the tithe. And we get off the rails with, well, is that before tax? Is that after tax? Is that on everything? Is that on, and we'll just really simplify that. We talked earlier about three categories: time, talents, and treasures. Mm-hmm. And the tithe really belongs out of all of those things. Yes. So treasures is the finances that have been brought in, but we often default to that as the easy button, right? So we in the faith that I could tell you that my tithe is on auto pay. It comes automatically out of my bank account and goes to the church. And so there's not a lot of worship in that. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's not a lot of worship in writing a check. Yeah. And so then you got to ask, where's my heart in all of this? Am I meeting a legalistic obligation? And if you are, the answer is don't tithe. If you're just doing this for an obligation and checking off a box or saying, now I'm good spiritually, you probably should reconsider everything about giving, both time, talents, and treasure in those arenas, because our heart is what God is after.
And that's the core principle. Is ultimately that is what Christ is looking at. Whether you go to Old Testament or New Testament or today, as a livestock producer, whenever they sacrifice the animals, they took their firstborn, the perfect one, the best one, without mm-hmm. blemish, and you gave that to God under the sacrificial system, because it wasn't that he needed that animal. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills.
That's right.
He wanted to see what your heart was. It was, you go back to Abraham and Isaac, whenever Abraham walked Isaac up that mountain to sacrifice his son, mm-hmm. That was his precious child, the one he had waited his whole life for. Mm-hmm. And it was ultimately God said, are you willing to put your son in front? Are you willing to put me in front of your son? And that's hard. And that's hard. The whole point of the tithe to me, and it goes back to what you're saying, is it's about the heart. Is my heart for God? Am I willing? Money sometimes is, as you said, the easiest thing to give. Right. The hardest thing to give may be our time. Mm-hmm. When we're packed and we got a million things going, and the neighbor calls and says, hey, can you come help me change a flat tire? Yep. That can be a time of ministry. Mm-hmm. Do we do it? And then if we do we do it willingly, or do we do it begrudgingly.
Right.
Oh, I've got to go help me again. I got 15 things to do. I don't have time to do this. I'll go ahead and do it. You might as well not do it because your heart's not in it, and they're going to feel that. They're going to feel that spiritually. So it's going into and having a ministry that says, regardless of the time, regardless of the money, regardless of what it is, I will give to the Lord, and I will give cheerfully because, I want my offering to be received.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And back to your original question, the other thing, and I really want to caution people because I hear this, I won't say a lot, but I hear it on occasion, is I'm going to give something, but then I'm going to expect something back
Right.
from God.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't an investment account.
Right.
You don't give $10 to get 15. You give 10 because you trust God with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to, and He's going to do that. If He happens to give you 15 back, that's great. Sometimes He does, sometimes He doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't mean if I give 10 that nothing else is going to go wrong in my week.
Right.
That's the whole thing, is you don't give with the heart to receive. You give with the love of who Christ is, to say, take my time, my talents, my treasures, and do with it what you want.
Yeah. Now let's flip that for just a quick second, because the reality is if I give 10 in the hopes that I'll get 15 back, then I'm not recognizing that 100% of what I have belonged to God to begin with.
100%.
And so am I giving to get, or am I giving because He's already blessed me?
He's already
given to me. He's already given me breath in my lungs. He's already given me 24 hours in the day. He's already giving me the fruit of my labors for the sake of being a good steward. And at the end of the day, you can hunt for, and I promise you can go right now and search on the internet, is the tithe for the new covenant? And you'll find 100 answers saying no and 100 answers saying yes, and everything in between. And ultimately, my question would be to you, is the heart behind the reason why you're looking for that answer to feel good about not doing anything more? And if that's the case, don't worry about what you're doing. Worry about where your heart is in relationship to God.
And the last thing I'll say is, in the finance world, sometimes we see this where someone goes, okay, today I'm going to give 10%. The problem is they've never given 10% before, and they put themselves in a severe financial crisis.
Right.
Because now, instead of doing so, if you haven't been given and feel called and led to give, don't feel you're better off giving 3% and giving it with a good heart versus 10% begrudgingly, or putting yourself in a spot where you're going to have to go get, but work over time towards those goals of the giving that you want to give, whether it be a tithe to a church, an offering to a ministry, or wherever you're looking at it. Do it over time. That way you don't shock yourself financially into making yourself in a worse spot, because I've seen that really come back and play. But if it's good to be called, and it's good to give willing with a great heart. Just got to be careful. So sometimes you have to walk into it to get to the path in 10, 12, 18 months that you want to be. But by that time, you've been able to adjust your lifestyle to it.
There's a great passage of scripture that doesn't have anything to do with money and has everything to do with faith. Jesus talks about if you have the faith of a grain of the seed of a mustard seed.
Yeah.
And a mustard seed is like the smallest of seeds, but yet the tree that bears the fruit that mustard comes from, the mustard tree, is a very large tree. So I mean, at the end of the day, you're sowing a mustard seed, and you may not have the faith of the tree to be able to do biblical finance in the way that you might want to, and that you really want to honor God. Start with the faith that you have and the ability that you have. And I'm going to say, mix that faith with practicality by speaking with someone who's been walking through managing their money from a biblical perspective, learning how to budget, learning how to be a good steward. All of those things will help you towards your goal of really being faithful with your finances.
100%.
And with that, we will see you all next week for another episode of Shifting Perspectives.
Have a great week.